The morning had begun quietly, almost peacefully, with the kind of calm that only comes to a house long lived in. I sat at my kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a chipped cup of tea my husband had bought me 40 years ago, and listened to the soft hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the neighborhood was waking slowly. Birds chirped in the early sunlight, and somewhere down the street, someone's car door slammed shut. The mail arrived with its usual mundane predictability. Bills, advertisements, an old magazine I had forgotten I subscribed to. I sifted through it all with the practiced motions of someone who has done this for decades, someone who knows the rhythm of life in a quiet home. Then I saw it. A thick envelope, heavier than usual, official in appearance, with embossed lettering that made me pause. My name was typed clearly across the front, but the sender was unfamiliar. My pulse quickened slightly, not with excitement, but a vague sense of dread that I had learned to trust over the years. Something about this envelope felt different. Important. Serious, and I opened it slowly, sliding my fingers under the flap with trembling precision. The paper inside was crisp, formal, and merciless. It was full of legal language I had only ever seen in books or on television, not in the life I had known, a life filled with small joys, careful frugality, and the invisible labor of raising a child. I read the words again, unsure if I understood them correctly. My son had sold the house. Not just any house. Not a property he owned or an investment he had made. My house. The one I had lived in for decades. The one my husband and I had worked our lives for. The house where I had grown older, where I had cried and laughed, where every corner held memory. And he had sold it without telling me. I sat there, staring at the paper, the words blurred as my vision clouded. My hands went cold. The tea in my cup lost its warmth. For a long moment, I could not breathe. Disbelief settled over me like a heavy blanket. How could he? I raised my eyes to the hallway, imagining him walking through the rooms, seeing me sitting here as nothing more than a background prop in his life. The betrayal cut deeper than any argument, any harsh word he had ever thrown at me. This was not anger yet. It was shock. Cold, numbing shock that wrapped around my chest and made it impossible to think. I remembered all the sacrifices. Raising him alone after his father died suddenly, when I was barely 38, left with nothing but determination and a sense of responsibility. Every night I stayed awake sewing clothes, patching worn shoes, fixing broken furniture. Every morning I got up before dawn, worked at the market, ran errands, calculated every penny, and made sure he wanted for nothing. I remembered how I had skipped meals so he could eat. How I had saved for his school fees while ignoring my own small desires. How I had celebrated his birthdays quietly, making them magical while quietly forgoing my own pleasures. How I had hoped that my sacrifices would cultivate gratitude, respect, love. And now, he had taken it all. I put the envelope down slowly, as though touching it could burn me. My knees ached from sitting too long. I could hear the familiar hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic, the birds outside, and yet nothing felt real. I was inside my own home, in my own kitchen, and yet it felt like someone else's world. I remembered the day he first asked to move back in. He was 38, tired of apartments that were too small, jobs that were too demanding, life that was never fair. "Just for a while, Mom," he had said. His eyes were tired, the way they always were when he wanted me to believe he was helpless. I had nodded, trusting that the boy I had raised would understand the meaning of boundaries. That while lasted 4 years. 4 years of borrowed time, borrowed space, borrowed respect. He paid no rent. He mocked the furniture, scolded the dishes, criticized my cooking, complained about every little thing that reminded him that the world did not bend to his convenience. I tolerated it because mothers endure. Mothers endure because love makes them blind, makes them quiet, makes them hope that things will change. But they do not. I remembered standing in the hallway, watching him walk past, seeing my own life shrink as his world expanded, feeling invisible, unimportant. I remembered the countless nights I had lain awake, wondering if this was what all those sacrifices had bought me. And now this. The sale. My house. My sanctuary. My life. I closed my eyes and imagined the rooms empty, strangers walking through, making decisions, judging, taking away the tangible proof of my existence. It was worse than any thief. A thief at least is outside, external. This betrayal was internal, intimate. It came from the very person I had brought into this world, nurtured, loved, and protected. I stood slowly, gripping the back of a kitchen chair for support. My legs felt shaky, but my mind cleared with every step toward the phone. I needed guidance. I needed clarity. I needed someone to tell me this wasn't real. I dialed the lawyer I had spoken to years ago about estate planning. He answered on the second ring. His calm voice reminded me of a rock in a storm. "Mr. Henderson, I need help," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound firm. He listened quietly as I explained the situation, the letter, the betrayal, the disbelief. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then, carefully, he explained something I had never known. The house could not legally be sold without my explicit consent. There were protections put in place after my husband's death. My son had assumed control where none existed. He had acted without authority. The sale could be reversed. I felt a glimmer of hope. Not joy yet, not relief, but a spark. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to consider something radical. I could fight back. I could assert my rights. I could take my home back. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I organized the papers, made notes, reread the letter, confirmed details with the lawyer. Each step was deliberate, precise. My body trembled with adrenaline, a mix of fear and power. For years, I had been invisible in my own home. Today, I would not be. That evening, he returned from wherever he spent his day. He was casual, unconcerned. He opened the refrigerator, complained about the leftovers. He did not mention the letter. He did not think I had opened it. "I can't believe how cold the milk got," he muttered. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had lived in my house for 4 years, claiming ownership of my life. I remembered every lie, every complaint, every little act of entitlement. And I understood clearly. He had underestimated me. Not anymore. I took a deep breath. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not beg. I simply said calmly, "We need to talk tomorrow, and it's going to be serious." His eyes flicked up, surprised. There was hesitation there, a shadow of the boy I had raised, but also the arrogance of the man who thought he could control my life. I did not flinch. I did not explain. I let the silence speak for me. And for the first time, I felt the weight of possibility. I was no longer just the quiet, enduring mother. I was a force, a person whose life mattered, a person whose home mattered, a person who would not be erased. That night, I slept lightly, dreaming of my house as it should be, bright, safe, and mine. The night was still, but my mind refused to rest. The kitchen was dark except for the glow of the streetlight filtering through the lace curtains. The letter still lay on the table, unopened but omnipresent, a silent reminder of betrayal. I sat in my armchair, clutching a soft blanket, and let my thoughts drift backward, far before the present pain, far before the frustration, all the way to the beginning. I remembered the day Quintessa was born. A small, fragile bundle, with skin like porcelain and eyes too bright for such a tiny body. I held her against my chest, feeling her warmth, her tiny heartbeat pressing against mine. She was my world, my purpose, my anchor in a life that had grown complicated and lonely after my husband passed so suddenly. Raising her alone was a challenge unlike any other. The early mornings, the endless nights, the aches of my back from bending over the crib, sewing clothes for her that I couldn't afford. Every stitch was a piece of my soul. Every small meal I skipped was a promise I made to her that she would want for nothing. The tiny apartment we moved into after my husband's death was cramped and filled with the smell of old wood and dried herbs. I painted the walls pale yellow, trying to bring sunlight into a space that felt too heavy with grief. I remember how I would hum lullabies while she slept, my fingers moving over the worn fabric of blankets, imagining a life of hope and possibilities. Quintessa grew quickly, faster than I could keep up with. By the time she was 5, she had her own opinions, her own desires, and her own will. I remember the day she demanded a dollhouse, even though I had only a few coins to my name. I worked extra hours at the market, haggled for every penny, and bought it anyway. Her smile that evening lit up our tiny apartment like a festival. I had never seen such joy in her eyes. But along with the brightness came shadows. I noticed her entitlement early on, the way she expected the world to bend around her wishes. I thought it was normal for children, that she would grow out of it. I hoped. I remembered her first school years, how I painstakingly made her clothes, patched holes in her shoes, and prepared lunches from scratch while my hands were raw and blistered. I cheered for every small success, every prize she won, every friend she made. And yet I noticed a creeping disconnect. The gratitude I expected never fully materialized. It was replaced by impatience, mild contempt, and a casual dismissal of all my efforts. Even as a teenager, she treated my sacrifices as if they were her due. She would complain about the outdated furniture, the old dishes, the fact that I could not provide her with luxuries I had never had myself. I tolerated it because I believed love demanded patience, understanding, and endurance. I tolerated it because I thought one day she would see and understand. But now, years later, as I sat in the silence of my home, I realized that understanding might never come. I thought of the first time she borrowed my credit card without asking. She had promised it would be brief, for a small purchase, and I had believed her. I remember the unease, the knot in my stomach that morning, and the flutter of worry that I ignored because I wanted to trust her. That trust had been misplaced, a seed of betrayal that grew unnoticed. I remembered how she mocked my cooking, my frugality, my thriftiness. How she treated my cherished antiques as if they were meaningless, old-fashioned relics of a life that no longer mattered. And yet, I had always smiled, always nodded, always endured, thinking that my love and patience would protect her from the world's harsher lessons. The sacrifices had been immense. I had skipped meals, endured back pain, ignored my own health, my own desires, all for the sake of giving her every opportunity. And she had taken all of it for granted. And now she had sold my home. I remembered my husband's voice, long gone now, gentle and reassuring, reminding me that our home was more than walls and furniture. It was a place of memory, love, and care. And yet, the home that he had built with me was being stripped away by the daughter we had both loved, nurtured, and guided. I thought of the countless evenings I had spent sewing, repairing, and preparing. How I had kept her life orderly, her needs met, her fears soothed. And she had treated it as nothing more than an inconvenience to her own desires. A cold anger rose within me. Not blind, burning rage, but a sharp, precise awareness that I had been underestimated for far too long. For years, I had been invisible, a background fixture in the theater of her life. But no more. I allowed myself a small smile. Bitter but real did I realize that survival and dignity were not about wealth, nor about possession. They were about self-respect, about claiming one's life, one's space, and one's boundaries. I had given everything to my child. Yes, but I had given nothing to myself. And it was time to change that. I began planning carefully, considering the options that had been hidden from me for years. I reviewed the legal documents, the house papers, my husband's will, and notes I had made over the years. Every detail mattered. Every overlooked clause, every small advantage could now be wielded like a tool of empowerment. I thought of Mr. Alistair Sterling, the antique dealer who had once appraised my husband's collection. His professional eyes had seen the value in things, even when I had been blind to it. Perhaps he could help. Perhaps the antiques, the heirlooms, the treasures of my life could now be the instruments of my liberation. I sat down with a notebook and pen and began listing everything that could be useful: contacts, resources, small savings, things I had overlooked in the haze of lifelong caregiving. It was meticulous work, but with each line, I felt lighter. Lighter and more powerful. I realized, with a clarity that startled me, that I had been preparing for this moment my entire life without knowing it. Every stitch, every careful penny, every act of endurance had shaped me into someone capable of reclaiming her own life. Tomorrow I would begin. Tomorrow I would act. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, painting the living room in streaks of gold. I rose early, as I had for decades, but today there was a different purpose behind my movement. No longer driven solely by routine or survival, I was fueled by clarity, by a fierce determination to reclaim my space, my dignity, and my life. I sat at the long oak table, pulling out every paper, receipt, and document I could find that could aid me in this endeavor. My eyes scanned the pages, absorbing every number, every name, every small detail that had once seemed trivial. These fragments were now tools, weapons even, against the careless entitlement that had invaded my home. I began with the antiques. They had always been my pride, a legacy of generations past, carefully preserved, cataloged, and loved. But now they were no longer just heirlooms, they were keys to my freedom. I contacted Mr. Alistair Sterling, the antique dealer I had once trusted, and explained my plan. He would appraise, advise, and facilitate sales, ensuring I got fair value for the treasures that had long been hidden under dust and decorum. Each piece I touched carried a memory, a story, a fragment of my life. The silver spoons, the delicate porcelain, the ornate jewelry, they had once symbolized my devotion to my family. Now they symbolized my claim to autonomy. I arranged them on the velvet cloths, polishing, inspecting, and noting their value. The rhythm of my work was meditative, almost therapeutic, and with each item, I felt a growing sense of power. Next came the documents. I reviewed accounts, bills, and banking statements. The mismanagement that had been forced upon me by careless hands was now within my control. I reorganized, prioritized, and set in motion strategies that would protect me from future exploitation. For the first time in years, I felt the heady thrill of control. But it wasn't enough to prepare alone. I needed witnesses, allies, and confirmation that my actions were justified. I contacted trusted friends and colleagues, those who had seen me endure, those who had known my sacrifices. Their support reinforced my resolve. They reminded me that I was not alone, that my life and choices deserved respect, and that entitlement could not continue unchecked. And then, the confrontation. I knew it had to be precise, measured, and unflinchingly honest. Quintessa would return from her beach escape oblivious to the storm brewing in her absence. I planned the meeting, the timing, and the words with meticulous care. I didn't intend cruelty, only truth. I would let her see, in no uncertain terms, the consequences of disregard and selfishness. Hours passed in diligent preparation. I rehearsed my words, envisioned possible responses, and mentally walked through the scenarios. Each iteration increased my confidence, sharpening my resolve. This was not about revenge, it was about reclamation, about asserting the life I had built and the respect I deserved. By mid-afternoon, the house was organized, the documents in order, the antiques ready for appraisal. I paused to look around, seeing not a museum of lost moments, but a home in which I was the curator of my own destiny. The shift in perspective was profound, empowering. I felt a warmth, a radiance that had little to do with the sunlight streaming through the windows and everything to do with the awareness that I was finally acting for myself. And then the call came. Quintessa's voice, casual, playful, oblivious to the plans I had set into motion. She spoke as though I were still the obedient, invisible caretaker, unaware of my intentions. I listened calmly, nodding as I sipped my tea. Every mocking comment, every feigned concern, only reinforced my determination. Her power over me, once unquestioned, had been quietly dismantled by hours of preparation and the clarity of my resolve. When she arrived that evening, sun-kissed and cheerful, I met her at the door with composure.
No rage, no Pleiadem, no visibile Anchiette.
Only calm, only authority. Her expression flickered between surprise and irritation. Quintessa, I began, my voice steady. We need to talk about the house, your behavior, and the responsibilities you've ignored for far too long. She opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, but I raised a hand gently, signaling that I would speak first. I presented the facts, the evidence, and my expectations. Every detail of her selfishness, every act of neglect, every misuse of resources was laid bare. Not to shame, but to illuminate. Quintessa's face paled, a rare crack in her armor of confidence. For the first time, she seemed to see me not as a servant, not as an invisible helper, but as a woman of intelligence, strength, and authority. The air between us shifted. Silence followed. She had underestimated me for decades, and now the weight of realization settled heavily on her shoulders. I continued, carefully, articulating boundaries, expectations, and consequences. I would no longer endure neglect, manipulation, or exploitation. My life, my space, and my choices were mine alone. She listened, and I could see the recognition of truth in her eyes. Whether she accepted it fully was yet to be seen, but acknowledgment had been made. When she arrived that evening, sun-kissed and cheerful, I met her at the door with composure.
No rage, no Pleiadem, no visibile Anchiette.
Only calm, only authority. Her expression flickered between surprise and irritation. Quintessa, I began, my voice steady. We need to talk about the house, your behavior, and the responsibilities you've ignored for far too long. She opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, but I raised a hand gently, signaling that I would speak first. I presented the facts, the evidence, and my expectations. Every detail of her selfishness, every act of neglect, every misuse of resources was laid bare. Not to shame, but to illuminate. Quintessa's face paled, a rare crack in her armor of confidence. For the first time, she seemed to see me not as a servant, not as an invisible helper, but as a woman of intelligence, strength, and authority. The air between us shifted. Silence followed. She had underestimated me for decades, and now the weight of realization settled heavily on her shoulders. I continued, carefully, articulating boundaries, expectations, and consequences. I would no longer endure neglect, manipulation, or exploitation. My life, my space, and my choices were mine alone. She listened, and I could see the recognition of truth in her eyes. Whether she accepted it fully was yet to be seen, but acknowledgement had been made. After she retreated to her room, I exhaled deeply. A surge of relief mingled with newfound pride coursing through me. I had reclaimed not just the physical space of my home, but the respect, dignity, and authority that had been eroded by years of passive endurance. The antiques would be appraised, some sold, some retained as symbols of legacy. The documents and plans ensured my financial autonomy. And most importantly, I had established a precedent. My life was my own, and no one, not even my own child, could dictate my worth or access it without consent. I sank into the armchair, letting the silence of the evening wash over me. The weight of the past decades had lifted, replaced by a quiet yet unshakable strength. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a life lived fully, intentionally, and without compromise. The morning sunlight poured into the apartment, soft and golden, illuminating the space that had been transformed not just by organization, but by a profound shift in energy. Yuli moved with purpose, no longer burdened by fear, doubt, or the quiet tyranny of a selfish household. Today, she was free in every sense that mattered. She began by checking her finances. The proceeds from the antique silver, meticulously negotiated, were now safely deposited, a tangible proof of her independence. Every figure in her ledger represented more than money. It was a symbol of control, foresight, and self-respect. Gone were the days of relying on meager social security checks to survive while others spent carelessly at her expense. The apartment itself had transformed too. Every object, from the heirloom spoons to the soft linens, had been carefully considered. What would stay to honor memory, what would be sold to secure freedom, and what would be discarded to make space for joy and light. The Museum of Obligation had become a home of empowerment. Yuli's thoughts wandered to her daughter, Quintessa. The girl had returned from her sun-soaked vacation, unaware of the changes. When she saw the house, she realized something fundamental had shifted. Her mother was no longer the meek, accommodating woman she had known. The authority in Yuli's posture, the calm confidence in her eyes, conveyed a powerful message. Life would no longer be dictated by entitlement or neglect. The first confrontation had established boundaries, but now came the demonstration of independence. Yuli began pursuing interests long deferred. A membership at the local Epicurean market allowed her to select fresh, luxurious ingredients, a pleasure she had been denied for decades. Each carefully chosen peach, wedge of truffle brie, and slice of smoked salmon was not merely nourishment, it was a statement of self-worth. Meals became rituals of celebration, slow, deliberate, and savored. The aroma of fresh bread, the warmth of a perfectly brewed tea, the delicate taste of imported cheese, all reinforced the simple, yet profound truth. She could provide for herself, and she could enjoy it. Every bite was a defiance of the years of suppression, a claim to the right of comfort and pleasure in her life. Yet empowerment was not only material. Yuli invested in her mind and spirit, revisiting hobbies she had neglected, sewing intricate patterns, reading novels that had waited for decades, and journaling thoughts that had accumulated in silence. Each thread, each word, was a stitch in the fabric of her renewed life. She discovered creativity she had long buried under duty and subservience. Social connections, too, transformed. Friends and acquaintances, previously aware of her quiet suffering, were now witnesses to her empowerment. Conversations were no longer defensive or apologetic. They were full of insight, humor, and vitality. Yuli began mentoring younger women, sharing her story of endurance and self-assertion, teaching the value of boundaries, persistence, and self-belief. The real triumph came quietly, in small moments. A morning walk, feeling the breeze on her face without fear or restraint. An afternoon spent sipping wine on the balcony, overlooking the city skyline, the hum of life below a gentle reminder that the world was hers to engage with fully. Simple pleasures became profound markers of freedom. Quintessa, observing all of this, began to understand. Her mother was no longer a passive fixture in her life. She was a fully autonomous being, capable of decisions, assertive in her space, and unapologetic about her needs. The lesson was harsh but necessary. Respect and care cannot be taken for granted, and independence is non-negotiable. Financial independence, personal satisfaction, and mental clarity merged into a profound sense of accomplishment. Yuli could now plan her days according to her desires, not according to the whims of others. Trips to markets, cafes, and exhibitions were chosen freely. Projects, sewing, and creative endeavors were approached with excitement, not obligation. At night, Yuli often sat by the window, reflecting. The city lights twinkled like constellations scattered across an urban sky. She thought of the decades of toil, the sacrifices, and the silent endurance. And she acknowledged them, not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the resilience that had carried her to this moment. She had become her own advocate, protector, and source of joy. Her life was no longer about surviving, it was about thriving. Every decision she made reinforced her autonomy. What to eat, how to spend her time, who to engage with, and how to celebrate her achievements. This newfound sovereignty brought with it a profound peace, a balance between action and reflection, discipline and delight. Even mundane tasks carried new meaning. Cooking, cleaning, arranging antiques, these were no longer chores. They were acts of self-care and assertion, affirming that her life was no longer defined by neglect or expectation, but by conscious choice. Each action was a brushstroke, painting the portrait of the empowered woman she had always been. The moral of Yuli's story crystallized in quiet moments. Independence is not granted, it is claimed. Respect is not demanded, it is earned through self-assured action. Happiness is not deferred, it is created through intentional living. Every challenge, every hardship, every betrayal had been a lesson, a step toward the life she now fully inhabited. Friends began to notice subtle changes, confidence in her posture, clarity in her speech, and radiance in her demeanor. Yuli welcomed their recognition, but did not rely on it. Her approval came from within, a deep-seated knowledge that she had acted for herself, honored her life, and reclaimed her narrative. Months passed, and routines became rituals. Mornings filled with sunlight, afternoons with creativity, and evenings with reflection and small celebrations. The house, once a museum of obligations and suppressed dreams, now hummed with warmth, autonomy, and quiet joy. Even the simplest gestures, a freshly baked loaf of bread, the perfect cut of cheese, the careful arrangement of flowers, carried profound significance. They were affirmations of existence, proof that her choices mattered, and celebrations of the life she had deliberately constructed. Through it all, Yuli maintained perspective. The past could not be erased, but it could be transformed into lessons and strength. Each act of self-care, each moment of thoughtful action, was a declaration. I exist, I am capable, and I will not be diminished. And finally, in a moment of rare stillness, she allowed herself a smile. The road had been long, fraught with fear, doubt, and neglect. But she had arrived, not by accident, not by luck, but by courage, intelligence, and persistence. She had rewritten her story. The city's skyline shimmered before her, an endless canvas of opportunity. She took a deep breath, savoring the cool air, the sense of triumph, and the endless possibilities that awaited. Yuli had become not just the curator of her antiques, but the curator of her life, free, empowered, and fully alive. She sipped her wine, reflecting. The greatest victories are rarely loud or spectacular. They are quiet, internal, and deeply transformative. In claiming her space, her voice, and her dignity, she had achieved something immeasurable: the freedom to exist, to thrive, and to fully embrace every moment. And with that, the story closed, not with an ending, but with a beginning. The beginning of a life lived deliberately, courageously, and entirely on her own terms. If you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe the channel Voice of Neem.